The word dungeon actually traces its roots to the Old French term dungeon, which didn't mean a dark underground prison at all. It originally described the great keep or central tower of a castle. Fascinating, right? By the way, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which part of the world you're tuning in from as we explore this piece of medieval history. Interestingly, the French word for an actual dungeon is cachot. In medieval times, the dungeon or great keep was truly the heart of the castle, a towering fortress encased by massive stone walls. It wasn't just built to intimidate enemies, but to endure through siege and chaos. These keeps were often cold, dark, and windowless, a design meant for survival, but one that also made them ideal for confinement. Imagine standing inside one of those halls. Picture the flicker of torchlight casting long shadows against the stone, eerie, yet awe-inspiring. Back in the 11th century, most early castle keeps followed a square design. But as warfare advanced and battering rams became a deadly force on the battlefield, architects quickly realized how easily square corners could crumble under pressure. The solution came in the form of round towers, circular designs that could deflect blows and absorb impact more efficiently. This evolution turned the castle's keep into an almost impregnable core, a symbol of endurance and timeless strength. In the early Middle Ages, the Great Keep served as the Lord's residence, a place of luxury and authority where he and his retinue could live, feast, and, when threatened, take refuge. Yet as centuries passed, its role transformed. The same impenetrable walls that once guarded nobility began to imprison others. The keep became a vault for treasure, a fortress for secrets, and eventually, a prison for men who had fallen out of favor. Over time, the word dungeon came to describe any jail or holding cell within a castle's confines. But more often, it referred to the cold, stone chambers buried deep below ground. Those claustrophobic spaces where light barely reached, and time seemed to stand still. It's important to note that imprisonment in medieval Europe wasn't initially a form of punishment. Justice was swift and brutal. Thieves were mutilated, traitors executed, and wrongdoers publicly humiliated. But war, as it often does, changed everything. During chaotic times, nobles and political rivals were too valuable to simply kill. They became bargaining chips, prisoners who could be traded, ransomed, or used as leverage. Only the most significant captives were kept for long periods. Holding ordinary criminals was simply too costly and impractical. Yet as these underground chambers evolved, some took on an even darker purpose, becoming sites of psychological torment and physical horror. And that brings us to one of the most feared and horrifying medieval inventions of all time, the Oubliette, a prison designed not merely to hold, but to erase. Our journey begins at the once magnificent Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, England, a fortress built in the 9th century and infamous for its vast network of suffocating dungeons. This castle has witnessed centuries of bloodshed, rebellion, and betrayal. In 1311, King Edward II imprisoned his own cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, along with 20 other rebels, within Pontefract's oppressive dungeons. None of them would leave alive. Decades later, in 1399, King Richard II, betrayed and overthrown by his rival Henry Bolingbroke, was secretly transported from the Tower of London to this same castle. There, beneath the Great Keep, in a narrow, airless cell of stone, Richard II met his fate. Some say he was murdered in the darkness. Others claim he was left to starve. Whichever version is true, the end was the same. On Valentine's Day, in the year 1400, the once mighty king drew his final breath at just 33 years old, paving the way for Bolingbroke to ascend as King Henry IV. Centuries later, Pontefract Castle's grim reputation still lingered. During the English Civil War, it became the last royalist stronghold to defy Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell, with his hatred of all things royal, vowed to erase the castle entirely. Brick by brick, stone by stone, until nothing remained but its ghostly memory. And buried within those ruins are the echoes of men who once screamed in the dark. In the aftermath of civil war, Oliver Cromwell was determined to erase Pontefract Castle from the face of the earth. To make that happen, he appealed to the townspeople themselves, urging them to petition Parliament for the castle's destruction. And the people of Pontefract, weary and scarred from generations of suffering, were all too eager to comply. To them, that looming fortress was not a symbol of glory, but of agony. A cold reminder of the countless times their town had been plundered by soldiers marching to and from its walls. Their homes had been looted, their men slaughtered, their women violated. The shadow of that castle hung over them like a curse. So when Cromwell's request reached Parliament, the people's voices carried with it a vengeance of their own. The petition was granted. In 1649, demolition began, and the proud stronghold that had once housed kings and rebels alike was systematically torn apart. Today, the ruins of Pontefract Castle still stand, silent, skeletal, and weathered by centuries of rain and wind. Yet beneath its crumbling curtain wall, some 35 feet below the earth, lie the remains of its dark heart, the dungeons. Cold, airless chambers of stone where cries once echoed and humanity was stripped away. But Pontefract was not alone in its infamy. Across Britain, other fortresses concealed horrors of their own. Originally built as a monastery, Chillingham Castle sat on the volatile border between Scotland and England, a perfect location for conflict. In 1246, King Henry III granted the manor to the Grey family, and less than a century later, in 1344, King Edward III ordered it to be transformed into a full-fledged fortress. The upgrades were chillingly specific: battlements, watchtowers, and of course a torture chamber and dungeons. During the brutal wars between England and Scotland, Chillingham Castle became the personal tool of Edward I, the infamous Hammer of the Scots. Here, prisoners were not merely held. They were broken. Captured soldiers, spies, even innocent women and children, all met the same fate. Their limbs were shattered, their bodies mutilated, before being hurled 20 feet through a trap door into the dungeon below. Imagine that descent. A brief moment of weightlessness, then the bone-snapping impact on the cold, unforgiving stone floor. Their only glimpse of the outside world came through a single slit of light, a narrow arrow hole piercing the thick walls. As days passed, the air grew heavier, the hunger sharper. Desperation drove some to madness, and others to cannibalism. It is said that nearly 7,500 Scottish prisoners perished within Chillingham's walls. Their bodies, unceremoniously discarded, were dumped into the nearby lake, a silent grave beneath the still waters. Farther north, another fortress earned its own sinister reputation: St. Andrew's Castle in Fife, Scotland. Built in the late 12th century, this coastal stronghold changed hands multiple times during the savage wars of independence. Under King Edward I, it became both a fortress of war and a prison of despair. In the northwest corner of St. Andrew's stood a sea tower, its upper levels once used to host noble prisoners under comfortable house arrest. But below that civility lay horror. The ground floor contained two chambers, one small room with a slit for ventilation, and another, far more infamous, known as the Bottle Dungeon, carved directly into solid rock. This pit was 24 feet deep, narrow at the top and widening at the bottom, resembling the shape of a bottle. It had no windows, no air, and no escape. Prisoners were lowered into the shaft like discarded objects and left to rot in absolute darkness. In 1402, David Stewart, Duke of Rothesay, heir to the Scottish throne, was confined there. Though he was later transferred to Falkland Palace, his fate was no kinder. He was left to starve to death, betrayed by his own kin. Years later, Murdoch Stewart, Duke of Albany, met a similar fate, imprisoned in the same dungeon before being executed for treason in 1425. Even Patrick Graham, the first Archbishop of St. Andrews, was not spared. Declared insane, he was confined until his death in 1478. For most, being imprisoned in the Middle Ages was not merely punishment, it was damnation. While nobles might receive lenient conditions, meals, bedding, and ransom negotiations, the majority faced unimaginable cruelty. Torture was not hidden in shadow. It was an accepted instrument of justice. Broken bones from the rack, fingers crushed in iron screws, flesh branded by glowing hot pokers. These were not rare punishments. They were routine, but for some, even that wasn't enough. From the twisted imagination of medieval tormentors came something worse. Something designed to make a person vanish not only from the world, but from memory itself. The oubliette. The very word comes from the French oublier, meaning to forget. And that is precisely what it was built for. A narrow, vertical shaft, carved deep into the stone, sometimes no wider than a man's shoulders. The oubliette was a dungeon within a dungeon. Prisoners were lowered into this pit of solitude where there was no room to sit, kneel, or lie down, only to stand in endless agony. Many were left there until death claimed them, long after their screams had stopped echoing through the walls. Some oubliettes were so deep underground that even the sound of a dying man's last breath was swallowed by the earth. It was not merely imprisonment. It was erasure, a place designed not to hold you, but to make the world forget you ever existed. All the filth, runoff, and stagnant water from the upper levels would seep downward, pooling into that nightmarish pit. The air inside was heavy with decay, the walls slick with moisture. When a prisoner was lowered down by rope into this narrow, suffocating shaft, they weren't merely being imprisoned, they were being buried alive. Down there, in that cramped abyss, they would be forced to stand in pitch darkness, sometimes ankle-deep in putrid water, and often upon the rotting remains of the last unfortunate soul who had occupied the same dreadful space. For some, the ordeal stretched on for weeks, surviving only on occasional scraps of bread or a dripping jug of foul water tossed down to prolong their misery. Others were not granted even that twisted mercy, left to starve in silence, their cries echoing into the damp stone until their voices faded forever. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer psychological torment. The trapdoor above slamming shut with a hollow thud, sealing off the only trace of light. The air grows colder. The smell of mildew, mold, and human despair fills your lungs. You shift your weight, and something beneath your feet gives soft, yielding a corpse. The walls are too close, too wet to lean against. The only sound is the scratching of rats. This, quite literally, was a dungeon within a dungeon. And the very name of this nightmarish cell comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. The oubliette, the forgotten place. And that was its purpose, to erase a human being from existence. Oubliettes were not confined to one kingdom. They appeared throughout Europe and even parts of the Middle East. The infamous Bastille in France, for instance, gained a terrifying reputation for their use. Built originally as a defensive fortress during the 100 Years' War, King Charles V expanded it in 1370, adding a series of deep underground chambers. Beneath its 6 great towers were cells where prisoners vanished into history, many never to re-emerge. In the east, in what was once the Byzantine city of Constantinople, stood Rumeli-Hizari, nicknamed Throat Cutter Castle. Constructed in the 15th century along the Bosporus by the Ottomans, it was as beautiful as it was brutal. On the 6th level of one of its towers lay a hidden doorway, an entrance to something far more sinister. When an unsuspecting prisoner was shoved through that opening, he would plummet more than 13 feet into a pitch-black cavity carved into the thick wall. Alive, but broken, left there to rot in the dark until death offered relief. Even England had its own version of this quiet cruelty. Beneath the White Tower, the oldest part of the Tower of London, there existed a cell so small it mocked the very concept of space. Measuring barely 4 feet across, it was impossible for a grown man to stand, sit, or even lie comfortably. This hellish box was ironically named Little Ease. With no windows and no light, prisoners were forced to crouch in agonizing positions for days or even weeks, their joints locked, their minds fractured. From time to time, they'd be dragged out for interrogation or torture before being shoved back into the blackness. Among those imprisoned there was Guy Fawkes, the infamous conspirator behind the failed gunpowder plot of November 1605. While nobles and high-ranking captives were often treated with a degree of decency, confined under house arrest within castle chambers and sometimes allowed limited movement, the oubliette was never meant for comfort. It was an instrument of terror. Sometimes a prisoner might spend only a few hours or days inside, as part of an interrogation tactic meant to break their will before questioning. Other times, it served as a death sentence drawn out slowly and deliberately. Conwy Castle in Wales offers a grim example. Built by King Edward I in the 1280s, the same monarch who sought to subdue both the Scots and the Welsh, it contained a structure known as the prison tower. Above ground, a chamber may have provided a wooden chair or a bed for a fortunate captive. But below that chamber lay the true dungeon, a 12-foot deep pit cut directly into the bedrock, accessible only through a single trapdoor in the ceiling. In 1440, at Pembroke Castle, a man named John Whiten learned just how merciless such imprisonment could be. Ordered by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester and Earl of Pembroke, Whiten was stripped of his clothing, deprived of food, and thrown into the oubliette. Alone in the freezing dark, he eventually went blind and succumbed to a series of incurable afflictions. A slow, pitiful end in a world that had literally forgotten him. Yet perhaps one of the most bone-chilling oubliettes ever unearthed lies in Ireland, hidden within the haunted stones of Leap Castle. This eerie stronghold, shrouded in centuries of mystery and blood-soaked legend, conceals a pit that once served as a vault for valuables. But over time, its purpose twisted into something far darker. The vault was transformed into a dungeon of horror, a narrow shaft fitted with iron spikes at the bottom, ensuring that anyone cast inside met a slow and agonizing death, impaled and forgotten in the shadows below. When workers began restoring Leap Castle in the 1920s, they made a discovery that froze the blood in their veins. Beneath the chapel floor lay the skeletal remains of over 150 souls. It reportedly took 3 cartloads to remove the bones, each one a silent echo of pain, betrayal, and medieval cruelty. Every fragment of bone, every shattered skull, whispered a grim truth about humanity's darker instincts. That in the medieval world, punishment was never just about justice. It was about fear, about power, about reminding others that mercy was a privilege, not a right. These oubliettes weren't mere cells. They were symbols of absolute control, designed to erase more than just a body. They erased identity itself, turning a living soul into a forgotten ghost of history. As we reflect on these haunting remnants of the past, it's a sobering reminder. The line between civilization and cruelty has always been thinner than we like to believe. Thank you for joining us on this chilling descent into the darker corners of history. You've been watching Vassal Truths, where we uncover the stories the past tried to bury. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows, like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a new revelation. And remember, not every dungeon was meant to be escaped, but every truth deserves to be uncovered.